Vladimir Zelensky recently had an interview with Lex Friedman. Here's what Zelensky had to say about corruption in Ukraine.
And I care a lot about the future of Ukraine is corruption. This is something you have cared a lot about for a long time. You won the presidency 2019 in big part your message of fighting corruption. But there's a lot of accusations that during war, I mentioned $9 trillion in the United States, war breeds corruption. So can you speak to that? How you have been fighting corruption, and can you respond to the accusations there has been corruption in Ukraine?
It's very simple. First of all, we really have a very sophisticated anti-corruption system. Sophisticated not in the sense that it's difficult to understand, but in that it really consists of many elements. It's the most sophisticated in all of Europe.
So, Scott, Volodymyr Zelensky says, I didn't play anymore because he does not explain how it's the most sophisticated in all of Europe, of course. So I wanted to ask you, what do you make of this in light of the current situation in Ukraine and where all of this is heading?
Well, the most sophisticated anti-corruption system in the world, I think, has the presidency getting a cut of everything and then working their way down. It is sophisticated. Tens of billions of dollars have been skimmed off of the money that's been sent over there and used to enrich people. I mean, all the Ukrainian elite who are no longer in power have left the country and are doing very well. The most sophisticated anti-corruption system in the world. Ukraine's the most sophisticatedly corrupt place in the world. Corruption is endemic, throughout. And Zelensky is one of the most corrupt. Seymour Hersh, who I have just again tremendous respect for, wrote an article a while back, but he said that the corruption got so bad, Zelensky's corruption got so bad that the United States had to send a general over there, and it might have even been Lloyd Austin, to sit down and say, "Hey, you can't be taken. You got to cap it at this level. You can't take any more than that." I mean, literally just confronting him straight up about the corruption and how it was not done. So we know that he's corrupt, but we continue to feed it. We just sent $500 million more today. Part of a multi-billion-dollar package that we're still trying to shove down the Ukrainian throats before Trump comes into office. A lot of that, doesn't Ukrainian, fingers don't touch it. And Zelensky did mention this in his in subsequent answer. He said, a lot of the money we don't touch. It basically gets reinvested into your defense industry to produce the weapons that we need. And he's right, but a lot of it he does touch. A lot of it is in terms of, cash, money. Anytime you have actual money coming in, but it's not just the money. There's things that can walk away or fall off the back of a truck, including Javelin missiles, Stinger missiles, etc., have found their way onto the black market to be sold off, along with small arms, mortars, ammunition. That's taking place. Plus the whole corrupt system. I mean, moving material across, Ukraine goes from, one mafia boss's sector to another mafia boss sector. Truck drivers, have to be bought off, and it basically increases the cost of doing business with Ukraine to unsustainable levels. This is why we can pour in, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of military goods and only see the equivalent of maybe, $50 billion worth of assistance, because the rest of it's being siphoned away. This isn't the way to do business. This isn't how you win a war. And the proof is what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. They're not winning the war.
What actually is the situation, on the ground now? Because it seems to me what Zelensky's behavior, and honestly the United States' behavior, over this last year or so in the conflict appears to be more managing the conflict and attempting to save face rather than coming up with any kind of quote unquote solution to Russia's advance. So what's the reality on the ground, and how effective has this been? Has Ukraine actually saved face?
Perception creates its own reality. So I guess it depends where you're sitting when that question is asked. The Ukrainians, and you see Tony Blinken, you see Lloyd Austin sit there and they spend. Lloyd Austin today, Russia has lost 2/3 of its military power, 700,000 casualties, all this. So the implication is that, this tiny country, Ukraine, has, punched Russia in the teeth. That says something. It's interesting that he doesn't talk about how, I think it's the commander of the commander of U.S. forces in Europe, Christopher, I can't remember his name. Sorry about that. But he's recently come out and said that when this war ends, Russia will be stronger than it was when it started this war. So why is it that the commander of American forces in Europe, the war fighter, is saying that no? I mean, what's happening in Russia right now in Ukraine is, we've made a hardened, combat experienced army that's bigger and stronger than it was before the war started. How does that jive with Lloyd Austin's 2/3 of military power? It's a weakened power and all that. It doesn't. So that tells you that, again, perception, creates its own reality, unless the reality it's trying to create is so fanciful that it's really just fantasy. And that's what's happened here. There's this fantasy that Ukraine is somehow capable of forestalling disaster and turning the corner and reversing what Russia's doing. Ukraine's on a one-way trip to, La La Land. The Russian army has been consistently advancing now for months. Their rate of advance has gone from 100 meters, 200 meters to a kilometer, 2 kilometers, now 5 kilometers, 12 kilometers a day. The Ukrainian army is falling back on a daily basis, and they don't have the troops necessary to prevent that from happening. So that's the state of play on the ground, where unless something that is done to change the correlation of forces, a sudden surge of Ukrainian trained manpower married up with modern equipment, that's not likely to happen. The Ukrainians are talking about having to, draft 18-year-olds, and you don't have enough time to train them, and so they'll go into battle ill-prepared. There's nothing that's going to change this tide, and we're looking at the inevitability of not just the military collapse of Ukraine, but also the political and economic collapse of Ukraine.
As we move into what will be a Russian victory, we don't have a timeline, obviously. We don't know when it's going to happen, but the writing is on the wall. This is a huge defeat for NATO, for the United States. This was supposed to be in new Cold War speak, the conflict that ends all conflicts, right? If you chop off the head of Russia via war in Ukraine, then guess what? The dominoes fall, right? It seems to me, though, that with Russia's victory, this is going to have reverberations, like huge reverberations worldwide. It's not just going to be a matter that's settled between the U.S., NATO countries, Russia, and Ukraine. It's going to have an impact everywhere. What kind of impact do you see Russia's victory having worldwide, given the fact that, both you and I have been following empire a long time. The United States, its foreign policy establishment, they love to just move on to whatever else they can move on to in order to achieve maybe similar objectives or the same objectives. Ukraine is different, though, because this is a direct conflict with Russia. And if you can't do that, how do you achieve that objective of defeating Russia, defeating China? It doesn't seem like it's possible. What do you think?
Had the Democrats stayed in power in the United States, had Kamala Harris won the election, we would see that the United States would be in concert with the European Union, and NATO toward, coming up with policy that sustains the fight in Ukraine. But we have a new president that's going to be sworn in on January 20th, and he appears to be moving towards not only an end of that conflict, but stepping away from, NATO as a vehicle that gets America entangled in foreign wars. He doesn't want this. Trump has said on several occasions, I mean, most recently in September, that our entanglement with NATO is, part and parcel of this policy that has us serving as the world's policeman, getting involved in unpopular and unwinnable wars. He said that America is the greatest threat to America. This is Donald Trump speaking. So I don't think Trump wants to continue these policy traps. I think he wants to get out of Ukraine, and with that, reduce, if not eliminate, America's involvement with NATO altogether. Now we switch to NATO and the European Union. Had they just said, okay, we lost in Ukraine, let's draw a line and learn from it, I think that they could survive. But because they have defined themselves, the modern iteration of themselves, based upon their resistance to Russia across the board, these are people who have leveraged everything in sanctioning Russian energy, and they've paid a heavy price. They're committed to the strategic defeat of Russia to an extent that the United States isn't, especially Donald Trump. This, I think, creates an unsustainable political dynamic. And it's not just going to bring individual nations down politically. We've already seen that. Germany's having a very interesting election in February, and Alternative for Deutschland could win. We see Macron under a lot of pressure right now. His efforts to manipulate the outcome of an election by not empowering the political forces that actually won the election, but trying to create minority governments to keep these other people out, is failing. One after another, prime ministers go away. England's in a crisis. Austria just elected a right-wing person, etc. So we see a political dynamic in there. We see an economic dynamic as nations' economies start to slow down or actually begin to retrograde. And some people, when talking about Germany, could even talk about getting on the verge of collapse. But here's the big takeaway from this. Biden talks repeatedly, or has talked repeatedly about, and so does Blinken and everybody else, NATO's never been more unified. NATO's never been more unified than they are right now. And the European Union is as strong as ever, and its relationship with the United States is as strong as ever. Except today, we had the French say, we're going to go to war against the United States if they try and take Greenland away from Denmark. Wait a minute, if you're so unified and NATO's so strong, what are you talking about going to war? And then you have other nations that just aren't interested in NATO. You have nations that can't meet their NATO obligations. Germany. NATO is weaker right now than it has been at any time, and NATO is on the verge of collapse. Donald Trump is not inclined to stay in NATO, and while ultimately there'll be a lot of pushback from Congress and from the establishment. There isn't going to be much pushback if NATO members continue to make stupid comments about wanting to go to war with the United States over Greenland. I mean, the best thing to do is just ignore it and say, no, well, we're going to wait until he does something. Why respond to a tweet? But instead, they're talking about the potential of having to fight the United States. That's the end of NATO. And European Union is falling apart. If AfD wins this election, they said they're unplugging from the European Union. The effort to, somehow align itself politically with Ukraine to talk about this greater European nation, it's failed. The European Union is a failed institution. It can't be resurrected or revived. And so I think we're looking at this war in Ukraine is going to reverberate more, widely than just simply on the battlefield. I mean, we're looking at drastic tectonic shifts in Europe politically, the end of NATO alliance, the dismantlement or collapse of the European Union, the reemergence of the European continent defined not by a singularity, but by a multiplicity of competing nations. Then another one is, and I'll leave this brief, but what Russia and China, they have strengthened themselves because of the American and European reactions against Russia. Their relationship is stronger than ever. Their economies have adjusted. They're doing quite well. But one of the ways that they're manifesting this new health is through BRICS. And of course, Russia hosted BRICS in Kazan, had a very successful meeting. But most people don't understand there because, again, people who watch the news, they're looking for instant results. They basically want you to plant the seed in the ground, pour the water, and wham, there goes the beanstalk. They don't understand it actually has to grow. Were they keeping an eye out on, and this is where it comes to China. What just happened? Indonesia.
Yeah.
Indonesia is a full member of this. Malaysia and Thailand want to join.
Yeah.
Both, it's indicated that they will be allowed. That's Southeast Asia.
Yep.
Right there. The United States, this is another area where the United States, ASEAN is a form, an organization that the United States likes to believe it plays a dominant role. But Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand jumping to BRICS means that ASEAN is not going to be the big dog anymore. BRICS is going to be the big dog. And watch what happens to the Philippines, because they're not going to sit there and be alone in this. And you're going to, I think, see the Philippines jump as well. And that's the end of America's position in the Pacific, and it's all to the benefit of China. So there are consequences to this, to what's going on in Ukraine that reverberate globally.
Oh, 100%. I mean, Indonesia and purchasing power parity, I think, is like the fourth largest economy. Of course, it's not the fourth largest economy in real terms, but it has an immense, or the seventh largest economy, sorry. But it has immense importance. It already is very close to China, of course, economically. But the whole U.S. strategy against both Russia and China has been to form alliances, right? NATO, expand it, get it closer together, defeat Russia. In Asia Pacific, get all these countries you can, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, everyone you can, defeat China all together. All of that is just completely eroding. And when Russia defeats Ukraine, when there is, of course, all wars, they end, whether they end in total defeat or whether there's a stoppage before the huge calamity, before Ukraine's government is absolutely taken over and becomes Russia again. Like, regardless of where and when this conflict ends, that plan, that strategy, if we can call it that, will completely fall apart, because NATO will be more disunited, more divided, more in disarray with really where else is it going to go? What is it going to do after that? And then with China, the rise of BRICS and everything that you stated, Scott, it's a very similar dynamic, but a defeat in Ukraine will just change everything around that and make it so that phenomenon only explodes even more, because how else will the world interpret this other than we need to do this? Most of the world is going to look at, we need to get out of the grips of U.S. unipolarity, because look at what just happened to Ukraine. That could literally be any other country that the United States looks at and says, well, you're useful to try to fight a war against Russia, or you're useful. The special forces, they're talking about preparing for war with both Russia and China. How are they going to do it? Oh, they're going to do what they did in Ukraine, basically. They're going to go there. They're going to form relationships with the government. They're going to help them form these militaries, all the funding and the arms, and then they're going to fight. that's what happened in Ukraine. That's a completely disastrous model when the opponent is Russia and China, because these countries, they can stand up for themselves and they can defend themselves.
No, we're looking at a whole new paradigm. I will say this, though, that Trump, I'm not supposed to read your comments, but every once in a while I catch one going up. And one of the people, basically said, Scott Ritter thinks that Trump is a deep thinker, because I try to say that, he may have a plan or he has a vision or he has a way of doing things. I don't think Trump is a simpleton. I think sometimes he seeks simple solutions because that's less friction, easier to implement, etc. But I do think that Trump is capable of understanding complex problems, etc. And I think, Danny, what you just outlined in terms of the, China's, advantages, etc. It's all predicated on the United States allowing the collapse of NATO and the collapse of the European Union to become a tar baby. To use the old, Brer Rabbit folktale. Got the tar baby and they get trapped and stuck and you can't get rid of it. Trump doesn't want to play that game. Trump wants to unplug from Ukraine and blame it on everybody but him. And then he's seeking to redefine the relationship with China. I mean, I don't want to get into it too much, but, China is behind the decisions that Trump, behind Trump's statements about acquiring Greenland and the Panama Canal. It's based upon bad information. Chinese military isn't in the Panama Canal. It's two Hong Kong-based, management companies that are, effectively managing operations there. But, Trump says that's a threat. That's China. In Greenland, China, a couple of years ago was trying to put in some mines, but apparently those are faltering. There's not as much Chinese influence that they thought, but Trump believes that there could be. And what he wants to do is create a fortress America that will restrict Chinese operations in its sphere of influence, and then look to redefine how America is going to economically compete. So I think Trump is looking at a completely different paradigm than simply falling into the trap of closely aligning the United States with NATO and the European Union, and therefore getting caught up in all the turmoil of the respective collapses of those two entities.